If pro is the opposite of con, what is the opposite of progress?
How you get so big in the food of this kind?
Alright, so there's been a lot of talk lately about whether or not Star Wars is political. There have been a lot of people who've gone on about how Star Wars is their escapism, and they don't like to see these messages, and they don't like to see things popping up that makes them think about whatever or what have you. There's been a lot of people who are like, war is literally in the title, and you can't have war without politics, therefore, duh, it's political. There's been a lot of this is new under Kathleen Kennedy, right down to, well, it's always been political, what's wrong with you? So which one is it? I think it might actually be a little bit all of the above. See, I think what we're actually having here is a semantics battle. So let me break it down for you. I think that there's three things going on here generically, and then we can kind of break that down into even more groups if you want, but it's really these three things. The first, there's people who just think it is political and they're super fine with it. The second, you have people who think that it's political in terms of actual politics, and they have a problem with it. And then there are people who are mad that the movie says, like, women can be lead characters, and they're upset about it. Those are kind of like the three groups. Now, I think that the third group, the group of people that are just like don't like anybody who's not who they perceive as best being in the movie, I think that this is a sizable, measurable group that is larger than it should be, but is not actually as large or as powerful as people like to pretend they are. They are large enough to be mentioned, not large enough for me to really think they have that much of an impact. They have an impact on my Twitter feed, but considering how important I rank my Twitter feed in like my life and my overall happiness, they're really not that important. So let's kind of ignore them like they should be anyway, for right now, and just talk about the other two groups. People who think Star Wars is political, and that's cool, and people who think Star Wars is political, and that's not cool. Let's talk about what we mean by political, and I think this is where we get into the semantics battle. I think some people say political, and what they really mean is topical. What they really mean is there is something in Star Wars that is reflecting, that is commenting, that is making a statement about something that is going on in the current world somewhere. But then I think there are people who are talking about something else. So basically, I want to draw a line here between the difference between topical and political. To me, political is anything that involves politics. Topical means something that's going on right now. So basically, all current events can be political, but not all political things are current events, is basically the way I look at it. I think that Star Wars is absolutely political, and I think it's absolutely fine. In fact, I think it's absolutely better that Star Wars is political. I don't think, and this is just my opinion, that Star Wars should be intrinsically about current events. Now, intrinsically is the key word there, because there are absolutely things in Star Wars that reflect current events, and there are absolutely things that either are happening in our own current events or things that were happening in events that were current at the time that impacted Star Wars movies. But impacting and prompting a writer to talk about an issue or talk about a goings-on is different than the movie being about it. The best example of this is something a lot of people have been talking about is the prequel trilogy. Prequel trilogy is like the political awakens, really, with George Lucas. And there's a lot of people talk about how there's so many things in the prequel trilogy, especially in Revenge of the Sith, that reflect the presidency of George W. Bush, who was an American president, if you're one of our non-US viewers and you don't know who that is. Now, I'm not here to talk to you about the presidency of George W. Bush. This is a Star Wars channel. I have no desire to engage with you about current events or events that were current in 2005. But he was absolutely someone that prompted writings out of George Lucas. There are so many things in Revenge of the Sith that reflect things that happened, from Palpatine's rise to power. How people who are so afraid that they start to give up their freedom was very much a thing that was going on in the 2000s, especially in the United States. And even lines that Anakin says, like, if you're not with me, you're my enemy, are directly referencing these things. I am aware of these things because I was 14 when Revenge of the Sith came out. I was kind of aware of what was going on in politics, and in the next election, I was gonna be old enough to vote, right? The first time I was able to vote was in 2008. And so this was all kind of happening at a time when I was starting to pay attention to what was going on around me. So I was aware of some of these reflections in the movie. However, if you are 14 today and you watch Revenge of the Sith and you've never heard of George W. Bush, you can still understand Revenge of the Sith. Just because there was commentary on who was president of the United States at the time that the prequel trilogy was being written doesn't mean that you need that commentary. You need to understand that layer in order to understand Revenge of the Sith. This is where we get into topical. There were things in Revenge of the Sith that were topical at the time. However, the idea of being afraid and therefore giving up your freedom is a thing that has existed since there's been war. The idea that if you're not with me, you're my enemy, this idea of we have to figure out who we can trust, that's a thing that's existed since people. I mean, go right down to the theme of certainly the original trilogy, but Star Wars in general, which is rising up against tyranny. Tyranny has existed since one person first gained power over another person and abused that person, which is basically since the existence of people. So what happens is there is something going on in current events that inspires an artist to make art that reflects those times. But what's going on in Star Wars is it's something where if you exist in that time period and you know what's going on, you probably can guess why this topic is being brought up. If you can still watch the movie 30 years later without that context, I don't think it's something that is intrinsically topical. Now let me explain. One of my favorite television series of all time is an American television series called 24. In fact, the main character in that show is named Jack Bauer. That is where the Bauer of Yoda Bauer comes from. The two people I have named myself after on the internet are Yoda and Jack Bauer. This show is very, very important to me. At the time the show was airing, pretty much any person I showed the show to got into it. They were hooked. They loved it. And I found as time goes on, the more people I show that to, the less people care. And I've come to the conclusion that that show was lightning in a bottle. That show was a show you had to be there for. It was a show that so reflected the times that when you get away from the times, it's harder to get into and harder to care. I can go back and watch the show because I was there, but it's a little bit different. And there's other elements involved. It was one of the first binge watch shows. It's right up there with Lost that kind of built binge watch television. And there's certain production elements to it. But it was also a show that was entirely topical. The presidents in the show were all fictional, and they didn't necessarily reflect a specific president we had, but everything that was going on in the show was very, very topical to things that were being talked about at that time in the US. And now, the show's a little bit outdated. The show is having conversations that we had, but it was having them in a context that you kind of had to be there to understand. Star Wars doesn't do politics in a headlines manner. Star Wars does things by archetype. So even though, like I said, it comes from something that we're going through at the time, that doesn't mean that it's something that loses that. It doesn't have an expiration date. So, for example, one of these political characters that a lot of people like to talk about is L3. L3 talks a lot about droid rights. You can argue that droid rights is a metaphor for LGBT rights, or immigration rights, or the kind of after effects of the civil rights movement that we haven't necessarily gotten entirely over. That makes it topical because the idea of somebody not having rights and trying to get rights is a thing we are fighting with now. That makes her topical, but 40 years down the line, she's still going to be relevant even if all of those issues get worked out in some sort of way where everyone's happy, as if anything in politics ever works that way. Whether it's about LGBT, whether it's about civil rights, whether or not it's about suffrage, whether or not it's about becoming a nation, whether or not it's about issues that people have fought wars over long before the United States was even conceived of. People have been fighting for rights. This is not an issue that we just kind of came in on today. What's happened is we have people, young people, who are becoming politically aware. And your kind of political awareness starts with whatever day you became politically aware. You don't magically gain a 50 years perspective. I didn't. I follow politics pretty well. I don't just magically know what it felt like 50 years ago. I can only kind of go by what I've been around for. And so I think there's a lot of people who feel like what's going on in Star Wars now is about them right now and what they're going through. And at this point, I want to share a quote from Knights of the Old Republic. So it's in the game. If you're walking around with Karth and Jolee, this conversation might prompt. Karth is talking to Jolee and says, "So Jolee, you've decided to leave your little hermitage in the forest and come help us stop the Sith. So you realize this war was worth coming out of retirement." And Jolee goes, "Yeah, that's right, Sonny. The Sith are the greatest evil to hit the galaxy since the Mandalorians. And they're the worst thing since Exar Kun. Blah, 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 etc., etc., etc." Conversation goes on after a little bit more back and forth, and Jolee ultimately says, "So we do what we have to do, and we try to stop the Sith. But don't start thinking this war, your war, is any more important than any other war, simply because you're in it. What we're going through, what we're dealing with politically in the US, in the UK, anywhere, is important. I'm not saying the issues we're facing today aren't important. I'm just saying they're not the first important issues to ever be talked about. So don't delude yourself into thinking that it's more important simply because you're aware of it this time." Let's go back to those groups I was talking about. You have the people who are fine with Star Wars being political, but then you have the people who want to use it as an escape mechanism, that they don't like that Star Wars is political now. Well, what do you do with Star Wars having always been political? Again, there's the semantics issue, there's, is it political or topical? But I think there's also a thing where they're aware of it because for the first time Star Wars is doing politics that aren't easy. So the original trilogy had the rebels fighting the evil Empire. And the Empire was obviously evil. In the first movie where we see them, they blew up a planet. There's not a lot of people who are going to stand here and say that blowing up a planet isn't morally void. It was obvious. And then we get to the prequel trilogy. And the prequel trilogy is a little bit more complicated because the Republic was corrupt and the Jedi were kind of bad. But what we did is we said that, well, that's not that it's complicated, it's that the prequels sucked. Because the prequels sucked, the Jedi were inconsistent because they weren't the good guys. They weren't written as good guys, so it must be that the movies were bad and not that the Jedi were complicated. It's not that the Republic was corrupt. I mean, people watched it and they knew it was corrupt, but they were like, okay, so I'm watching a thing about trade routes. I don't care. And now we get to what we're watching currently, and it's political and it's complicated. I wore this shirt specifically to bring up the Rebel Alliance. The Rebel Alliance has become complicated, specifically with characters like Saw Gerrera. Saw Gerrera kind of symbolizes a point that one man's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. That you can have somebody that's fighting for the good side that does something wrong. Right now, we don't like to talk about that, especially Americans, because we come from a country that was built on rebellion. We want to think that rebels are always the good guys because we were the rebels. And yeah, the rebels in Star Wars are the good guys, but you're not the good guy intrinsically because you are the little guy in asymmetric warfare. Sometimes you are, sometimes you're not. And what happens as we get older, as we become adults, and as we have to deal with things, is we learn that sometimes things are right and sometimes they are wrong, and it all depends on context. So what happened isn't that Star Wars magically became political. What happened is we became aware of politics, and the politics that are in the films have become more complicated. Now, does that mean it's different? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, the original trilogy had a far more simplified version of politics, but it was also the first 3 movies. George Lucas had to do a lot. He had to build a whole galaxy and explain space wizards and Death Stars and lightsabers and make all of this stuff make sense. And then you go to the prequel trilogy, and in theory, you already know. You already know what a space wizard is. You already know they have a lightsaber. You already know they can go in hyperspace. None of this has to be explained, so then he can start getting into the complicated nuances of his galaxy. Is it that the prequels just became political, or is it that they were a natural evolution now that Lucas had already laid the foundation? I had so much more I want to say. I still have other things written on my notes, so I might do a follow-up to this depending on what I hear from some of you in the comments. I'm just going to summarize it as this. Star Wars is political. Star Wars is not intrinsically topical. Star Wars has things in it that are topical, but that topicalness isn't needed in order for you to understand the material that you're watching. I mean, I certainly like Star Wars to be an escape, but I just don't really think there's been anything in it that is so intensely topical that I can't sit down and enjoy the film. I don't think the Star Wars films have an agenda that they want to make you believe other than maybe you should be the good guy. But I think they've been making who a good guy is and who a bad guy is complicated on purpose because those words are in fact complicated. So yeah, leave me a comment, let me know what you think. Don't leave a comment to me about like actual, shall we say, topical things. I'm not here to talk to you about current anything. My job is actually to deal with current events, and I don't like to talk about them unless I'm getting paid. So please leave me out of any and all of those conversations, because this is my free time. But please leave us a comment about anything broad and archetypal and then you want. Keep it political, but don't make it topical. Please follow us at Port Haven Forums on Twitter. Visit port-haven.com for even more. In fact, there's an amazing article there by our own The Dark Moose that I'm going to link below, which kind of gets into this topic as well. And until next time, keep it real and fly casual.
Cooking can be fun.